Good evening. My name is Khary Lazarre-White. I'm the executive director and co-founder of the Brotherhood Sister Soul, and I welcome you this evening to a conversation about social justice and equity in media and entertainment. The Brotherhood Sister Soul is a comprehensive youth development organization that works in the intersection of education, organizing, and training. We are based in Harlem, in New York City. We are in our 26th year of operation. We have a national reach as we train educators across the country on our model and have even done international programming as well. We are unapologetically a justice organization that focuses on issues of racial justice and economic justice, on gender justice and environmental justice. And so this evening, we thought we would have a conversation with three of our board members, dear friends of mine. The idea of this evening is that you'll be listening into what could have been a dinner conversation. We just decided to put this on live. And so we welcome you to the conversation. We welcome you to listen in and to join us tonight. I'm joined by three people: the co-chair of the board of the Brotherhood Sister Soul, Rahsan-Rahsan Lindsay. He currently serves as the executive vice president of advertising, sales, and marketing, as well as head of 1X Studios and One Solution TV One, Urban One's cross-platform marketing team as well. And Rahsan is passionate about social justice, equality, young people. He believes their voices are a key to creating the transformation we seek. And as the co-head of our board, he has provided incredible leadership to our work. And we thank Rahsan for joining us this evening. We are also joined by Tiffany R. Warren, AKA the R. Tiffany is the Executive Vice President, Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer of Sony Music Group, and is the founder and president of AdColor. As the Executive VP, Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer of Sony Music Group, she will expand the equity and inclusion activities and policies across all of Sony's music group, global recorded music, publishing, and corporate divisions. Previously, she served as a Senior VP, Chief Diversity Officer for Omnicom Group, where Tiffany oversaw a team of 25 plus chief diversity officers and directors, and really led the effort of Omnicom-wide DEI and change efforts. She's a highly regarded leader in the field of diversity. She's a talent strategist. She has over 24 years of championing diverse professionals in the creative industry. And as I'm sure many people tuning in this evening, and I'm sure as many people know, she founded AdColor in 2005 and has launched the AdColor Conference Awards, a Futures Program, and AdColor in Music. And as the president of AdColor, she's been widely recognized for the progress and direction creative industries have taken around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we welcome Tiffany to our conversation this evening.
Thank you, Khary.
And last and certainly not least is Detavio Samuels, who is the CEO of Revolt. And over the last year, Revolt has made a pivot with a focus towards social justice, and they see themselves as not just a place to cover the news, but really as a catalyst for change in the movement. So Tiffany, Rahsan, Detavio, I look forward to our conversation this evening, and let's get into it. I want to really start with an open-ended question. Maybe I'll start with you, Rahsan, due to your seniority on our board, and just ask you, how do you bring social justice and equity into your work in the media space? There are many folks who don't think it has a place in media. It certainly historically has not been an institution or a sector where one thinks of social justice and equity as central to it, but you bring it in every single day. And I'm wondering if you can just speak to that, and then Tiffany and Detavio.
First, I think that was an old joke, and I think that's actually part of it, because at the end of the day, when I talk about the importance of social justice, first of all, I need people to understand that we're almost exclusively talking about human rights issues, right? And when you're talking about human rights, some of this stuff to me should be a given, that people should have opportunities, that they should have access to affordable healthcare and food, and that in an industry like ours that is very clearly not very diverse, has not done its job in terms of ensuring that those opportunities are afforded to folks on any number of levels. And I think the biggest thing I do on a regular basis is let people know that I'm not going to let you convince me that I'm crazy, that the actual data shows not only that you've not done anything to actually try to create diversity and equity in our industry, but you've actually worked against it in some of the practices and in the hiring practices in particular, in the investment practices in particular, the percentage of the population versus the percentage of your budget that you invest on Black owned or POC owned media, et cetera. So, I mean, it's really calling people out on it. People don't necessarily like to hear it, but it's the only way to really move the needle. People who are honest know that it's true. The facts are there. I'm not telling you something that isn't proven out by the data. So once we can have that conversation, we can have an honest conversation. I'm not going to let you convince me that I'm crazy. I know it's what's happening and what has happened. Now we can start to talk about how we can move the needle in the right direction. And even for things that everyone thinks are wonderful, I challenge them on those things. Lots of companies now want to do work with HBCUs. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but most of them have been around for 100 plus years. What about all the people that have graduated over the last 80? How about just people that have graduated over the last 20? So you only interested in people who are currently in college, which means it's going to be another 20 or 30 years before we really see the difference. Those are the kinds of things where we sometimes think we're doing a great job, and we actually have to push the envelope more and let people know that there are other ways to think about it. If you think an HBCU graduate is someone you want to consider now, then you should also think about the people that have graduated from those same institutions over the past 20 or 30 years, because likely they're just as qualified as many of the people who are already in the industry. They just haven't had an opportunity. And so that's really kind of how I approach it.
What about you, Tiffany? What's your take on that?
Wow, what's my take? For someone who spent 24 years in this work, the first year I stepped into agency life, and then my second year I stepped out, and by agency I mean advertising agency. And my second year I stepped out and into diversity, equity, and inclusion when I was 25, 26. And I remember specifically being in rooms and having conversations where people would whisper the word Black or whisper the word white when talking about, equity and race, where, DE&I was sort of a backroom conversation. It wasn't main stage. Because when you look at the corridors of power and where people are talking about these issues, it wasn't part of popular culture to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. When it was talked about, it was very one-on-one. It was very much like, what internship programs are you doing? How's that scholarship going? They didn't talk about the complexity and the nuance of what it means for people's careers to be seen early on and be given this opportunity to rise, not only in the company, but if they leave the company, then go and have, even greater success at other companies. So, I have a very specific long spectrum of seeing the evolution, not only of the conversation. And by the way, social justice wasn't even talked about. People were like deathly afraid of talking about social justice and activism in corporate boardrooms. Even going so far as to say, we don't talk about that stuff here. That stuff is outside of our doors. We're not responsible for that. But then would turn around and certainly hire and try to mobilize people of color, not only to create, work, but also to get them out of trouble if something happened. But yet social activism is outside of the purview of corporate America. This was just like the late 90s, early 2000s. It wasn't that far off. And so when I look at what's happening now, I mean, it warms my heart because I have seen the spectrum, but it's still not enough. And, I think people take advantage of the fact that diversity feels very commonplace now, particularly, like I said, in the places where power is consumed and created. We were not allowed in those rooms, on those lists, on those stages. And so in a large part, I created Ad Color because, like Jada Pinkett said, if we're not getting seen on those sort of mass market stages, we need to create our own. And that speaks very much to what Detavio does with Revolt. And simply put, it's very much, all of us coming together to but make sure that we're in lockstep with the end game, and the end game is equity. It's equity. Rahsan said it beautifully. It is human rights. It's crazy to think, and I've said this time and time again, I'm very grateful for the career that I have. But I do, in moments sit back and go, it is my job to teach people how to treat me as a human. That's crazy to me. but it's my job, you know? And the
Mhm.
thing about it is there's individuals outside of corporate America whose job it is to call out, to make the noise, to march. Then you need those inside that call in and that work to build relationships so that what you're doing on the outside gets heard on the inside. You need both of those sets of people to create that social justice that we're looking for. It's not marching and supporting, and you know, we have a $100 million global justice fund at Sony, which has given money to 300 organizations, and we're looking at the 2.0 of it. And I'm so proud of my colleague Tuwalami, who's watching tonight, and what she's been able to do. But part of that too is also a company is a building that's made up of people that work in systems, and we have to make sure that we change those systems so what's being done on the outside takes hold on the inside of corporate America.
Yeah, and then from my side, you know, I'm blessed and fortunate. You know, I think I've spent most of my life trying to figure out how to make work and personal one and the same. And I'm blessed to be in a moment where my work and where my social justice personal work and my social justice professional work are all one and the same. And so how does that happen? So Revolt is a company who can only do one thing: lead a revolution. We made the decision after the murder of George Floyd that the revolution we wanted to lead was all about social justice. And so embedded in our purpose is this idea that we won't just cover the movement, that we will be an active catalyst in the movement, specifically in the movement in the fight for Black liberation. So it is embedded in our purpose. It is our assignment. We wake up every day knowing that that's why we exist, and that's what we're here to do. How it shows up in the work, one, we are like starch like champions of social justice. And so whether that means the content we're creating, or to Tiffany's point, the boardrooms that we're in, and the way that we are calling out brands and advertisers and CEOs, helping them to see and understand what's happening in this moment and challenging them to be bold and courageous and to step up. That's one. Two, it's built into our own business model. And so one of the reasons why we continue to invest, why we continue to encourage advertisers to invest with Black-owned media, is because we make those dollars circulate in our community. One of the paths to freedom is economic justice. And so as they give us those dollars, we are putting those dollars into Black-owned companies that are production companies, directors, writers, et cetera. And then the third way that I think it really shows up is as more and more brands are spending larger dollar sums with Black-owned media, we have a pretty simple framework for the solutions that we create. We're essentially saying, okay, you tell me what you care about: gaming, healthcare, food, I don't care. Whatever it is that you care about, I can promise you that there are inequities for people of color on all of them. And so tell me what you care about gaming. We're going to come up with a solution that fits the Revolt brand that can at least make a dent in that world. And so also not just getting the money and circulating the dollars through our community, but developing solutions with brands that can have a positive impact in the social justice space in our communities.
Love that.
So, you know, Detavio, you use the language of social justice and of, you know, revolt, which is obviously the words behind you, and you know, in the word revolution. And you know, when we talk about the Black struggle for freedom in this country, if we just focus on that specific struggle for a second, you know, the role of media has always been both a central aspect of it, but also something that has actually been diametrically opposed often to the advancement of Black people. And so, you know, if you go back to the time of slavery in this country, the African-American narrative, the African-American story of being enslaved was central to spreading the word about the horror of slavery, whether that was Harriet Jacobs' autobiography or Frederick Douglass's. Frederick Douglass uses the media, he uses newspapers to spread the word of the horror, the inhumanity of this institution. You know, you think about David Walker's Appeal, which was a book that was banned throughout much of the South because of the aggressive language of justice. One of the lines in David Walker's Appeal was, "It is no more harm for you to kill a man who is trying to kill you than to take a drink of water when thirsty." Right? This was a book that was banned, and he was assassinated for writing it, but he would travel throughout the country spreading his appeal. You obviously know, people like Ida B. Wells were central to using newspapers post-slavery and using the written word again to articulate another way. You know, you think about the iconic images of "A man was lynched today." the iconic signs, I am a man, of the civil rights movement. But you also think about that very unique moment when, you know, the elders, and many of them not that old, but the adults in the civil rights movement made a decision to allow children to march, because they knew that when the media captured images of children experiencing hoses and dogs, being beaten, it would terrify many people, those of goodwill, maybe move some even to action. And so there's this history of Black people throughout this country utilizing some forms of media to tell our story, but at the same time, the other side of media being in place to suppress our story, to violate our rights, to say we are inhuman. To Tiffany's point, we have to establish our humanity because of generations and centuries of the propagation that Black people are inhuman or less than. And so those two realities, those histories, but also that current reality, are very much in existence today. And so as people who have operated in traditional, predominantly white spaces of media, but also Black-led spaces of media as well, how do you navigate that duality? That it's actually been central to our movements for change. And I just, mentioned the written word, but obviously we talk about film and talk about music and, talk about culture. But then also we've always had to push back against the onslaught of the media against our advancement. And I wonder what that looks like today and how you deal with that duality in your work.
Yeah, it's a hell of a battle. I would say that the way it exists right now is it's like we've got a water gun and we're up against nuclear weapons. I'll tackle that question on both sides, on both of the fronts that you gave me. So one is, as it relates to the Black Free Press, is what we call it. We have watched the murder and almost the extinction of the Black Free Press. You think about our newspapers that popped up in the 1800s, which were the first places where we got to celebrate our own heroes. It did some of the places where we built our first millionaires, and we got to tell all of our own stories because nobody else was going to tell those stories for us. Fast forward to today, Black newspapers are pretty much almost extinct. Black radio, barely exists. On news, when you look at news, the few people that had news in the past, TV One, BET, those things are all gone because advertisers don't support Black news because they don't want to be around conversations around police brutality and social justice. And so what we've watched is, again, almost like the systematic destruction of the Black Free Press. And so we see ourselves as one of the last standard bearers in that kind of reality. And so we are making sure that we cover all of the stories in the way that we believe our people need to know them. Last week was the 100th year anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre. As far as I know, I know Roland Martin was down there. But outside of that, they were like, we were down there covering the story, and not covering the story about celebrating 100 years. We're covering the story from the Black perspective, which is, y'all still haven't given me back my land. Y'all still haven't given me back my money. Y'all just built these $30 million museums and you're doing all of these things for show. Meanwhile, we would take $30 million in our pocket and it would create change. And so anyways, like the idea there is that the Black Free Press is a critical component to our culture, that it is dying or has been dying over the last kind of decades and years. And we are fighting for that voice. The other piece of it is what we also try to do with advertisers is a lot of times the people who give you money can get to censor you. And so they'll say, oh, you posted that, we don't want that story. We don't want to be aligned with that story. We're really big on pushing back on those conversations right now because we believe that Black people and the free press needs to be free. We need to be able to tell the stories in the way that we tell the stories that are relevant for our community. So that's one. The second one is the bigger battle, which is the one that you were talking about, and why I'm saying it's like you're in this nuclear fight and you've got like a water gun. Right now, again, big champions of touting the story that the Black-owned media right now is 1% of the marketplace. So 1% of the inventory, 1% of the revenue, which means that non-Black-owned companies are responsible for creating basically all of the Black stories, and non-Black-owned companies are responsible for extracting all of the value out of those stories. And I know everybody wants to have a conversation around representation, and representation is key, but the real problem that we have is really based in control. If you have Black people in control of these companies, they're going to cast Black people. They're going to tell more Black stories. We just don't have green light power in Hollywood. And so the way we are fighting that battle is that's where we are really challenging brands and advertisers. You have to fund Black-owned media. We can't be 1% of a market when our people are 14% of the US and drive 80 to 90% of global culture. You need to fund us so that we can tell our own stories. And so our hope is that by fighting to be free and tell the stories in the way that our community needs us to be able to tell them, and then partnering with brands who see us, who understand the fight and the mission, who fund us, that we can be large enough to then basically create an entity that can go head to head with all of the other people who are telling the narratives that are not beneficial to us. And so that's essentially kind of the way that Revolt sees our role in this current marketplace.
Tiffany, Rahsan, thoughts on that exchange, on the duality of the experience?
You want to go, Tiff?
Well, Khary, can you repeat the question again? Because Detavio blew me away with his answer. I'm just keeping it real.
Get out of here.
We'll go to Rahsan and then we'll pivot back to you, Tiff.
Yeah, but Rahsan, if you could repeat the question and your answer, thank you.
So I'm going to answer it a little bit differently, only in that I do think it's important that, you know, when you think about Black media and the role it's played, and that's not just in, you know, the revolutionary discussions that we're talking about, the social justice discussions, but even just in humanizing us, right? There's so much that just about how do we humanize Black people? How do we talk about the fact that we have the same kinds of problems? It's interesting because on the one hand, sometimes we're treated as inhuman, and in other ways we're treated as superhuman, right? Black women don't need pain relief even after they've given birth. Black women don't know what they're talking about when they say, oh, by the way, I've gone through this before. I possibly have a blood clot that's going to kill me. Can you please pay attention? No, only when my white husband says it do I get, paid attention to. Serena Williams, for those who don't know that. So that duality is another thing. And then there's so many instances where we have sort of a few exceptional people who've broken through, and those people are often paid like lots of money to produce content or whatever. And sometimes it's needle moving and does really great things for us as a community. But the truth is, exceptionalism isn't really generally going to move the needle widely. It may move a little bit from a perception perspective, but the stuff that Detavio was talking about in terms of investment, so that we can tell our own stories. And I know this is unpopular, but I would rather than have, and as much as I like, a Kenya Barris or Shonda Rhimes, I'd rather than have them sign $300 million deals, I'd rather have 10 people sign $30 million, or 30 people sign $10 million deals, or even, honestly, 300 people sign $1 million deal. Because what you're going to get in terms of the overall scope of work, the actual material itself, there's just going to be tons of it. What the thoughts and ideas are. The truth is, there's so few even archetypes that we see of ourselves. So we're fighting on multiple arenas, and then couple that with you didn't ask about this, but it works with what you asked about, the fact that at times we've had the U.S. government actually be the ones paying for the propaganda, right? Just say no to drugs, the war on drugs. The United States government funded that to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars in media that was taken in by mostly private companies, but including private companies that broadcast over public airwaves, ABC, NBC, CBS, that never have to re-up their licenses or anything, but make tons of profit, and do so sometimes, even though what they're propagating is actually what we happen to know, and maybe people didn't know at the time, but we talk about law and order, things like that, anti-Black rhetoric that ultimately resulted in a 10x increase in incarceration, right? Like, so it's not just that we don't have the mechanism in terms of the Black press that we used to have, and Black newspapers is probably the greatest example, because it's so much of the way things were communicated. We're actually able to communicate directly with each other without everybody knowing, right? Without Uncle Sam or Big Brother knowing. Not only do you not have that, but then you also have your own U.S. government paying private companies to basically continue the propaganda, and by the way, lining their pockets and continuing to do all the things that really racism is the greatest examples of racism. So I'll use this as anecdotally. these days in media, we see it a lot in social media in particular, we see lots of examples of bigots, people who use the N-word and, and say all kinds of, racial and homophobic slurs, et cetera, and they get called out and shamed and all that stuff. Well, the people that we're talking about, including these companies, these private companies that accepted money from our government to essentially find ways to criminalize Black people, don't have any Black people or any people of color on their board. They have a room of 30 people where one person is of color. That's racism. They ain't call anybody an N-word. They haven't done any of those things, but that is what racism is. It is when you can systematically oppress people based on race, and that includes exclusion. So it's easy to call out the bigot at Walmart that says something stupid, but meanwhile, we're not calling out these people who are clearly operating from a position of, the biggest racist you can imagine. And I use examples like the NBA, if it's 70% Black, and yet, I forget what the percentage of coaches are, but it's like 6 that are Black. The NFL, that's 75% Black, and there are 3 Black coaches and 4 coaches of color overall. What is that but racism? There's no other way to explain that, not based on legacy, not based on experience, or any of those things. So when you think about the media and not just the power of what Black media was, but you also have to think about the power of what mainstream media has been to actually drive a narrative of inhumanity, of criminalizing us, making us to be lazy, that we're looking for a handout, despite the fact that you're the one who has burned down our cities, has taken all of the books out of our schools, has built highways through our neighborhoods, but somehow it is our own laziness and our own shiftlessness, quote unquote, that has led to our current plight. And so it has to be looked at both ways. Not just do we not have the power that we used to have, but we're literally fighting against this machine that's constantly beating a drum that is almost exclusively, or at least it has been almost exclusively negative when it comes to portrayals of us. And I think there's no greater example than the nightly news.
Right.
Yeah, I love that. Can I jump in? Oh no, you, Tiffany.
Yeah. I feel like I'm in a mayoral debate, but let me just break in for a little second so I can add my. But no, I think sort of my experience, particularly in a different kind of media, like I guess you could say short form media when it comes to advertising. We are more comfortable and we have wonderfully normalized. I remember starting out where there wasn't a conversation about LGBTQIA, particularly in advertising. There was really a small amount of awareness. I remember specifically growing up, looking at commercials, searching and waiting for someone of color to come up in these commercials in between shows that didn't show me at all. Like I was just looking for scraps. We still haven't, for the most part, and we're in 2021, normalized how people of color are represented through marketing and advertising. We're still having the same conversations that I had back in 1999 and 2000. And so there's, the soft targets are the organizations, particularly, the multicultural marketing agencies and things like that. They're soft targets to say, hey, you're not doing enough. But at the end of the day, we're part of organizations and associations that say they're for multicultural marketing, but why are we in 2021 and the budget is still under 1%? You're giving your money, you're giving your support to these organizations that literally have multicultural marketing in their name. And that particular segment is still in the same place. And so, when Rahsan talks about systems of racism, one of the things that I often do particularly is, have we identified the problem? We talk about it all the time. Have we identified the root cause? Have we really gone into really, really deep the root cause of why there is consistently a problem with getting budgets for media of color, and why there's consistently a problem where those budgets are given and they're not the same as their white counterparts? And so that does affect the quality of the creative that comes out. It's for the most part. And then have we expressed any empathy for the fact that despite not having all these budgets, despite always being sort of pushed to the side, that these companies have grown and innovated, and then those innovations are then taken to other companies, and those companies make millions and millions of dollars off of that innovation. The innovation that's going to come out of COVID is going to make a lot of people very wealthy. It's going to make it's not going to make the people that innovated wealthy, but it's going to make a lot of people wealthy. And then do we have a strategy? Have we collectively figured out a strategy versus this whack-a-mole strategy that when something pops up, we get angry and then we get a little bit of resolve and then we go back to doing the daily work? No, we haven't collectively come together on a strategy. And then finally, who has sacrificed to actually move this problem forward? Who actually has sacrificed anything? You know, when I saw what
Did Tiffany freeze for you as well?
Tiffany,
Yeah. I didn't know if it was me. I was like, what?
why don't you jump in, Detavio, with what you're going to see, and hopefully Tiff can rejigger her
Come back.
Wi-Fi. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you know, you mentioned it earlier, you were talking about our history and Rahsan gets into our history. And I think that's also one of the biggest things that we're trying to do is educate people on our history. It's just that kind of age-old notion that if you don't understand where we've been, you won't understand how to figure out how to get to where we're trying to go. And when I talk to brands, I don't even talk, for me, it goes beyond, look, Khary, you're way better at than me. You literally got like 1 billion books behind you, right? But the way I tell the story is, that the first racist was in 1415. I think his name is Gomez de Zura. He was the chief historian and biographer for Prince Henry of Portugal. And what made him the first racist and what made him so unique is not only does he talk about capturing people and enslaving them, that was normal. Like European nations were enslaving other European nations, African nations were enslaving other African nations. What makes him different and unique is that he talks about capturing and enslaving Africans, but defending it. He made it missionary work. He's the one that says, these people are savages. These people are wild animals that need to be tamed. This is God's work to enslave them. That story happened in 1415, spread like wildfire, which is one of the reasons why I think you see so many European countries going into Africa to colonialize them. And so that idea that a book that was written in 1415, that narrative and that story finds its way to the US, right? And is present when the first Black people hit touch ground in 1619, is still present with Rahsan's story when he's talking about the 80s and the war on drugs, and it's still present today. While the names may have changed, maybe they're not saying animals or savages so much there, but they're still saying drug dealers, hustlers, pimps, whatever those things are, the themes are still the same, that we are dangerous and less than human. And we have to believe that if storytelling and media got us into this mess, then we have to believe that it's going to play a super critical role in getting out of this mess. And the last thing that I'll say is, you know, this African proverb that I've been dropping for like years, which is until the lions get their own historians, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. The idea being we need our own historians. It's not enough for them to say, put him on the screen. We have to say, give the lion the damn pen. And ultimately, like that's what Revolt is trying to build, exactly what Rahsan said. It's not about one big name or two big names. It's about this idea that there are billions of stories across the diaspora that deserve to be told. And we have to find a way to elevate and uplift those stories. And doing that is our chance of shifting the narrative for Black people globally. And I think it's all in media. That's why I'm here.
Powerfully said, Detavio. Tiff, you're back. Do you want to finish your thought?
Welcome back, Tiff. We missed you.
Listen,
You left off at empathy.
It was a dramatic pause.
do you understand like what I was like, what, who is trying to stop this? Okay. I was just talking about like the idea of, you know, have we created any empathy for the situation that many of these multicultural marketers and media outlets find them in? I think, you know, a couple of years ago, there was all this brouhaha about like, you know, these outlets selling out, like they were not a multicultural media owned anymore. They were multicultural media targeted. And how does that affect, you know, their point of view? I was like, ownership has changed and that will make a big difference. But there was this idea of like, oh, if they're not owned, then we don't want to put dollars. I mean, there are real conversations that are happening behind the scenes that impact millions of dollars and where it goes. And what I was trying to say is that there's no collective strategy to figure out how can we come together versus sort of yelling at each other. We're yelling at the wrong targets. And so that is, you know, one of the things that I work really hard on is like calling people in and saying like, we all have the same journey that we're supposed to take. We all want the same thing. And instead of looking at it as a whack-a-mole and being reactive, we need to be more strategic about it. And then finally, like, what are we willing to sacrifice? At some point, I became very well aware that in the role that I have, that a lot of what I'm going to do, I may not benefit from. And I'm in the third part of my career. And so my thing is about building legacy, and it's about doing the best that I can at this moment in time to build something for individuals that I haven't even met yet. You know, that these are people that are coming in, because I know when I came in the industry, none of what we see today was there. And so that's why I have a big belief that do something, do the work, put the work in, and figure out how we can collectively change this landscape. And media is a very big bucket. It encompasses a lot of things, including music. So here I am doing my part within the music industry to try to make a difference, where unfortunately for many, many years, there wasn't this discipline present. So it's really about looking across the landscape and supporting each other and then moving forward together, because the ultimate end game is equity and freedom. And we don't have a lot of that right now in the entertainment and media industry. Regardless of the unicorns, I call them the Shondas and the Kenyas, regardless of the unicorns, it's still very, very inequitable.
Absolutely. And I think, came from a complete, dearth of possibility and opportunity for folks of color, for Black folk, for women. And now, just with the few stories of what you're calling a unicorn, people want to act like, the whole conversation has changed.
And can I add something too? There was a meme that went around that was so telling, and it said everything that you needed to know about the current situation. Someone did the research, and gratefully, I'm happy they did it. But there was this meme that went around with in fact, all the music supervisors for all the shows that we love. So like Insecure, I mean, you name it, the music that we listen to and we're like, this soundtrack is fire. There has to be, someone, culturally relevant behind it. Every single music supervisor on the shows that we know and love, including, I think it was Queen Sugar, and there's so many, were white.
Right.
And that's because systematically, what's the entry point for music supervision, right? There's an entry point. And at that entry point, what does it take to get into and break into music supervision? It's not, it's not the sexiest part of music, but it's important because it's part of telling a story. And so I look at that entry point and I say, okay, what I have to do in terms of doing my part is partner with an organization like GFS to see if we can create a music, supervision or scoring fellowship so that we can get people into the pipeline. It may take a couple of years, but you've got to start somewhere. So I always say, like, take a look behind what is going on, and then take a look at the entry point and how people get into those particular positions. And that's where the work begins.
I want to pick up on something that you mentioned and that Detavio mentioned about media and really about the responsibility of media and the distinction. We've gone through this period, this recent political period of this really intense conversation about, what is truth, or what is the role and responsibility of media and advertising, from social media to traditional media. And when you start looking at issues, when you start looking at coverage that, calls into question the very humanity of people, when you look at what the Trump administration did with regards to a ban on Muslims, a ban on people because of their faith, because of their religion, the part of the world that they come from, that it was covered only through the lens of a policy and not a violation of people's human rights. When you look at the silencing of trans rights and the fact that so much of media, again, paints this as a story of on one side and on the other side, of kind of false equivalency, as opposed to the freedom for all people to be who they are unapologetically. Two other examples. You look at the language that Trump used of the China virus, quote unquote, and the repeating of this language that has led towards violent attacks against Asian Americans all across this country. Our fellow citizens in many places afraid to go outside because of violent attacks on them simply because of their ancestry or their nationality. You look at issues of immigration in this country, and depending on where you see the numbers, 12 million, 15 million, some estimate it to be 20 million. The language of alien, the language that strips from people their very identity, that uses inhumanity and does not look at the wholeness of people, does not tell to the point that Detavio is talking about people's story, but instead media played a central role in just 4 examples of the demonization of people's very humanity. And so how do you, again, push that conversation in media so that it moves from a false equivalency? Well, on one hand, Trump says this, and on another hand, liberals say this, to instead covering a story that's about humanity and inhumanity, and taking a position which is very different than trying to be apolitical, but instead trying to take a position on our fellow citizens and the humanity of all people. And I'm just wondering kind of what you all think is the role of media in that. We know that there's been so much attack, rightful attack, on the inhumanity of media. How do we move it to a more humane sector that really takes the stand on these key issues?
You want to go first, Tiff, since I think we both got first? No? All right, I'll start with the first thing. I mean, you basically said it in your question, is language, right? Language is so important. Undocumented versus illegal is a very big difference. And unfortunately, often, either phrases, terms, or specific words are used, adopted quickly, and then become the way to, sort of explain things. Like, I personally don't like white fragility. And the reason why I don't like white fragility is because I think it lets, generally speaking, in the situations that I'm talking about, white people off the hook. It's actually hatred. The thing that makes many of the folks respond the way they do is actually hatred toward, Black people in particular, people of color, could be trans people, et cetera. And usually when we're talking about white fragility, we're talking about often a Black and white issue. And so I hate that term because it makes it seem like, oh, it's because, the poor white people, they're just fragile as all. No, there's actual hatred, and there's real, action that's being taken that's hurting others. When media takes responsibility for what it reports, obviously, when you're talking about news, that's one type of media, but there's tons of narrative media. There's obviously, documentary, et cetera. There's something important about understanding research and fact checking. Those two things are really important. Often they use things like allegedly and stuff that is saying, so I'm not saying that Tiffany did it, I'm just saying it's alleged. But because I'm reporting on it and I've yet to do any fact checking, I actually am off the hook just by saying alleged, because if one person says it, then it is alleged. And so ultimately that kind of stuff makes a huge difference. And while it may seem like we're being nitpicky, we're not, because we're the ones that are suffering from things like when the president of the United States says the China virus or Kung flu, right? And then we have people responding to that. And the other thing is, and this is a little bit harder to articulate or really think about what's actionable, and that is when we speak about these things, people tell us we're crazy. They tell us we're being sensitive. We're overreacting. It's not true. The fact is, those words and that language is meant to evoke a certain response in people, and it works. And so when you say Kung flu, you say China virus, people go, yeah, it's their fault. Attack them. And so the media has to have responsibility, not playing sound bites. I would say at least some of the social media platforms took some responsibility to saying, hey, this is not factually correct, or please do your own fact checking, et cetera. But that kind of stuff has to happen more often. We have to be willing to not play certain sound bites 50 million times, because what's happening is they're doing it because it's driving ratings, which ultimately is driving revenue. And we have to realize that because we haven't decoupled the revenue with ratings, and in particular when it comes to news reporting and stuff like that, then we have instantly added a potential reason, and ultimately a financial reason, why the news organizations and other media outlets are going to continue to preach a narrative, or at least report on a narrative, because it's going to drive revenue. And so we have to continually look at those things, look at what is the thing that's driving not just the storytelling, but the repetitiveness of some of the narratives. We have to be willing to say, we've heard enough of this narrative, we need to understand the other side. I mean, even when it comes to whether it's Republican and Democrat, most of the time you have, first of all, you shouldn't actually be able to be called a news organization if what you do is almost exclusively editorial. That's actually something that's supposed to be managed by the FCC. That is their job, and they don't do that job. They also, there has, with balance in terms of, political views and things like that, those things are generally not enforced. And I'm just talking about one thing. I'm just really talking about news. Once you get into, and I'll leave, time for Detavio and Tiffany, but once you start getting into narrative, now you start, like, if the only things that get greenlit by Hollywood or are either slave narratives or, drug narratives for African Americans, then what you're going to get is a whole lot of the same thing, and you're going to get very little other kinds of storytelling. You're actually creating, helping either create or perpetuate stereotypes that end up in sort of the actions and the ways that people get treated. And so the media has a huge amount of responsibility in thinking about what's the balance of that. How much, if you have a show, even if it's doing better, if you air Love and Hip Hop or Black Ink Crew 5 times more than you air anything else because it has the best ratings, you're literally saying, we think that this is the most important narrative to to display or exhibit about this particular audience or for this particular community. And what it does is it creates, obviously, sort of an upside down situation where you're only getting 1 or 2 things. And ultimately, you can say that media doesn't have power, but Tiffany and I, all of us have worked in advertising. We know it works. You say that Big Macs are on sale for $3, Big Macs are gonna start selling tomorrow. It's just what it is. And so we can't advocate responsibility when it comes to narrative and storytelling and news, and yet say, but we know the medium is powerful when it comes to advertising and marketing. We have to say, we know it's powerful, and we have to be willing to take responsibility for the messages that we're giving.
Yeah, I think that's great. I'll add a couple of things that's just based on how Revolt tackles things, but Rahsan basically hit on everything. So fact checking. So we stepped into, probably last year, we stepped into this year saying that the biggest concern we had for our people was them getting misinformation. And so we started a series on fact checking because we want to make sure that our people always have and understand the facts. Rahsan hit on that point. Part 2 for us is balance. So we have a show called Revolt Black News. The idea there is we believe Black people are smart enough to make their own decisions. It is not our job to tell them what to think. It is our job to arm them with the information and the education, and then let them make their own decisions. And so as often as possible, we try to make sure that there's always balance in the conversations that we're having. You can hear from a Black Democrat and a Black Republican. You can hear from someone who believes that it's X, and you can hear from somebody who believes it's Y. And then we're trusting you, the audience, to make the decision that you believe in, because our North Star is not driving you to believe a certain thing, and our North Star is not driving ratings. It's trying to free our people, and freedom is choice. And we have to give them the choice to choose what they want to believe. And then the last thing that I'll say, which gets back to your point about humanity, Khary, is like, if you want to get to humanity, you have to go to the people. That's it. Like, so much of the conversation is being driven by the same news voices, the same pundits, over and over and over again. If you want to understand, if you want to help the world see these people as human, you have to go to where they are. That's why we went to Tulsa. We don't want to tell your story. You live here. This was your people's land. How do you feel? And I think giving the microphone, again, that's why it's important about who's in control, because who's in control chooses who gets the microphone. At Revolt, we choose to give the microphone to our people on the ground. If someone gets shot in Minnesota tomorrow, we will be there tomorrow with the microphone saying, how do you feel? It is not our job coming from a national perspective to comment and opinionate on everything. We want to get the voice from the people. And so those are the 3 ways we do it. We're going to fact check. We're always going to have balance, and we're always going to give the microphone to our people because we believe they deserve it.
I love it. So I want to reference a project that Khary and I worked on years ago, if you remember, Khary, which was The Talk. So we partnered with an agency to create an ad that brought to bear to the national consciousness. And I think we were ahead of our time now, looking at sort of what's going on and what's happening in advertising, where now there's a bit of a consciousness and there's a small bit of a soul when it comes to surfacing conversations about what matters to Black consumers. But it was a very powerful commercial about a father talking to his son, and then it was a white father talking to his white son, and how different those conversations were. And now everyone knows that conversation. It's in popular culture. People understand it, they can reference it, they can talk about it. But at the time, it was very, very groundbreaking. And it's those kinds of disruptions and those kinds of taking a chance, even when the populace is not talking about something or it's not on their tongue, is to say that we have a responsibility to try to change the narrative. I think of the work that, organizations like Color of Change have done, and Rashad Robinson, particularly when it comes to media. But at the same time, again, these things are happening on the outside to disrupt the inside. But if you don't have the individuals inside that can change the systems, that can green light the talk with BroSis at an agency, then how do you move things forward? I'm so proud of, what Revolt is doing. I'm proud of some of the things that we're doing, particularly around language, specifically looking at and addressing even the term master. When the music business was started, we talked about masters, and believe it or not, the copies of that were called slaves. So that language was embedded in the beginnings of the music industry. And not until the last 4 years did the industry collectively look at the language, more specifically at Sony Music Group, and finding another way to say the term master. Original source, that works. Copies, that works. But to your point, language is really, really important. The term urban was started to celebrate where the music came from. And then at some point it boxed people in. And so looking at what does that term urban mean today when it comes to music? Many people celebrate it. They're proud to have it in their title, to have it in the way that they express their work and their business. And there's another faction that says, I don't want that in my title. I think it hems me up because it was co-opted to put people in a box. And so we're doing our own internal conversations and looking at the language that we use. Pharrell was very, instrumental in sort of looking at that language. And it's going to be hard to get out of the zeitgeist. I mean, we say master bedroom. I mean, these are things that are in popular culture. This is not an urban myth. There is a reason, and there is you can trace the origins of some language that we use every day that was meant to put people in their place. And we still use it because over time, memory fades. People don't share the stories, and we look at it as commonplace. So without getting too particular in terms of different language, because I could be here all day and drop some words and you would be like, I did not know that that's what that meant. But I think it's a responsibility for us, just when we're talking about people's personal pronouns. If, it is a safety issue in terms of how people see themselves. That whole idea of like, I'm going to call you what I want to call you. It's that same energy that says, I'm going to tell you who you are. And so sometimes people think, oh, that's happening over there. That doesn't have anything to do with me. It's the same energy. It just takes different forms. That's all.
I'll tell you right now, I want to have that language conversation, not today, but on another day like that. That master slave.
I was today
like
old when I learned that.
Yeah, no, that's bananas. You know what I mean?
I know that.
It's so critical that we unearth these things because there was a really great book a long time ago. Maybe it's called Black Power CEO. I don't really remember what it's called, but the idea was that in the 60s, a lot of the fight for the Black Power movement was happening legally because so much of it was in the law. Then as those were, as you no longer see signs that say for colors only, everything becomes intangible, everything becomes amorphous, everything becomes invisible. And so it becomes a lot harder to fight. And so making the invisible,
it becomes ambiguous. And the thing is,
that's
people try to make
for.
us think we're
that's
crazy. So when we say that law and order is just like saying keep the Black people or the people of color in their place, they go, you didn't say that. What are you talking about? So, and that's the thing. The ambiguity is created.
That's the word I was looking for.
So that
that's the word I was looking for.
You guys are overreacting. You're just too sensitive, or you're nuts. That's not what was said. And it's like, no, but we know it's what was intended. So I think, that language thing is obviously really important, but it's also important because Tiffany, I know some of these things, right? That we can even decode the things we think we know. Actually, here's what it really means. Here's what
I struggle as someone who's in DE&I. Like I'll say something and I'll be like, because it's muscle memory, and that's how powerful language is. I mean, I have a 5-year-old niece and she has a mastery of language, Rahsan, as you know. But I'm always like working, thinking, okay, watch what you say. Like you just don't even know that some of the terms that you're using actually was embedded in your language to hold you back. It's so scary. And so, I think particularly as we all fight all the different cultures, all the different, ethnicities and sexual orientation and people with disabilities. I mean, it's if I can say anything, if my headline is really, it's the same energy, right? It's just, it hits every group different, and sometimes it hits the same, particularly the AAPI community. I pushed myself, and not that I had to, it was just something that was particularly weighing on me. I've been looking at Asian cinema, Asian movies, and really taking it in and really trying to inform myself about the Asian experience. I mean, I have friends, I have colleagues, but it's not the same. I think people have to push themselves to educate themselves. It's not on, it's not on us who are experiencing the racism to educate, obviously it's important that we educate ourselves, but for me, it's about exploring and understanding what other cultures are going to, and then recognizing it's the same energy. I mean, the words that have held that community back would knock you on your butt, because you're like, I can't believe people are saying this and they're saying it so normally. But
also the things that people think are positive, like model minority, it's not.
Correct.
If it puts you into a box, it's not.
Correct.
And then it also ignores the fact that tons of
Correct.
Asian people actually are living below the poverty line, and they get ignored because if Asian people have a higher household income, oh, they're okay, they're fine. No, it doesn't mean that. So yeah, you're 100% right.
Yeah, and I also love that point, Tiffany. I think that's something I took really seriously last year. So I'm also open to anything you want to send me in terms of what you consume from an AAPI perspective. But this idea that like last year we were saying, how could you not know? It was in our music, it was in our movies, it was in our stories. Like we have literally dropped clues everywhere. How could you not know? And so then I take that and I flip it on the other side for anything that would make me uncomfortable. Probably the best example. Last year, I watched I May Destroy You by Michaela Coelho. And maybe like the first, which is really a story about rape culture, right? And probably by episode 2, I'm uncomfortable. And I'm like, yeah, I don't really want to watch this. Like, I'm not really here for it. And I kept just hearing back in myself that I'd been telling people, but we dropped all the clues in our music, but we dropped all the clues in our movies. And I had to say, you know what? I owe it to people to sit through so that I can get to understanding. And it's understanding that I think that we as a people are missing collectively. That's why we don't see each other as humans. So anyways, I'm all for it. Please send me whatever you have, because the same way I'm going to challenge other people to do it, I also have to take ownership to do it myself.
Absolutely.
Last year, I keep, hearing you all kind of talk about the role essentially of media in social justice and movements. One of the things we talk about a lot at Brotherhood Sister Soul, and you all know this well as board members, is the fact that it's always been young people at the forefront of social change movements, whether it's the civil rights movement or the Black Power movement, whether it's the LGBTQ movement for civil rights, whether it's the women's movement, the Chicano movement, farm workers movement. You just kind of go down the line, the anti-war movement that brought down a president. And we saw that last year. We saw young people at the forefront of protests after the murder of George Floyd and the murder of Breonna Taylor. We saw that go international in a way that I think we had not seen before. We all grew up with the long line of Black people, Black bodies, being attacked and killed by the state. We all could run through all the names of our childhood to our teens to our adult years. But something different happened last year for wider consciousness. A lot of times people say, people's eyes were opened last year. And I always say, like, well, whose eyes were open?
Right.
Our eyes weren't open. We already knew what was going on, to your point, Detavio. But the wider part of society's eyes were open. And so many young people, led those protests all around the world, all around the country. We know the central role of social media in that effort. But we also know the danger of it. We know the danger of kind of social media warriors and feeling that this is going to happen in a very quick amount of time, and that actually what we are pushing back on and taking the baton from the generations before us, is institutional bedrock prejudice in this country, the country we know was founded on it. And there was a sign I saw a lot of young people holding during protests, and I was on, more protests than I could count last year. And it came from a good place, but it was deeply problematic, which is you messed with the wrong generation, essentially. As if, Harriet Tubman's generation weren't freedom fighters, or Sojourner Truth's generation weren't freedom fighters, or Black Panthers were freedom fighters. And so I understood where it came from, but I think we're in a dangerous place with a lack of connection often to our history and to the narrative, the generational approach. And again, I think media was central last year. It keeps coming back to me of this kind of dichotomy. It was central in spreading the word. It was central in telling our story. It was central in elevating Breonna Taylor's story and George Floyd's story and so many more. But it also is deeply problematic that it was something that was covered by news and covered by media for profit, for sales, for clicks, and so much of that coverage has now gone away. And so it again begs the question of kind of the role in media in protest, all the ways it can be used, but the inherent danger of it as well. And I know you've all seen this from the inside, from advertising, from marketing, from news, et cetera. But you live your life as, you know, Black people in this nation with a deep connection to your legacy in this nation. I'm just wondering, again, how you deal with that kind of dichotomy when we look specifically at the protests last year, the largest our nation has ever seen. And, you know, now when we look at actually the silence that's out there about the same issues that produced those protests.
Yeah, for me, that's why you need the Black Free Press, right?
Yeah.
Because it's going to fall off of other people's radar. It's going to become unimportant to other people. You know, I think, you know, collectively, there's a belief that we get the moment that we had last year only because of quarantine, only because, you know, folks weren't playing basketball, only because people were in their house. Fast forward to today, where we can't wait for the world to be open. That story's not going to hit as it used to hit. But don't you worry, Revolt stays on it. You know, my fundamental belief is, while I hate to see Black people murdered by police, it is literally the thing that, like, I learned last year. It's the one thing that maybe helps get allies. And so every time a young Black man or a Black woman is murdered, like, A, our team is on it, and we're going to be on it for 24, 48, 72, as long as they protest and we covering it. I don't care if CNN or nobody else is doing it. But then I'm also in the boardroom saying, do you see what's happening on those streets? Do you see how egregious this is? If this has been happening for 400 years and we're just now discovering it, imagine what's been happening in corporate America. Imagine what's been happening in your boardroom and your hallways. And so leveraging these really terrible, unfortunate moments to, as the Black Free Press, still try to create collective awareness. And then the last thing that I'll just say about that, like, you know, you mess with the wrong generation piece, which I'm with you. I totally get. I think for me, the way that I process that is that there's this feeling that we might actually be at some sort of like an inflection point that, you know, when Harriet Tubman was alive, we weren't at an inflection point, so they couldn't feel it. I think this generation feels a tipping point that other ones never got to feel before. And so it's that type of excitement, but they're definitely sitting on the shoulders of hundreds of years of real work. And I'm more just focused on the inflection point. This is the moment. This is the time for us to be bold, be courageous, because we might actually be able to flip some stuff. And I'm trying to flip as much as possible while we can.
So
I would add in terms of the inflection point, you know, I will politely disagree because I grew up in Boston. And so the inflection points that I felt growing up in Boston, segregation, busing, you know, I was very politically active in Boston, serving as a press secretary for Senate candidate of color. You know, political activism was part of my leadership development. You couldn't help if you were given the chance or opportunity because of the schooling that me and a lot of first generation students had while coming up in Boston to go to private schools, to go to private college. We felt compelled to always be in touch with, you know, what was going on politically in Boston. And in terms of that inflection point, I think about how I benefited in the 70s from what was done in the 60s. And so what is the next generation going to benefit from the stuff that's happening now? You know, I'm always looking at the movements to say, okay, what are the consequences of that movement? And part of it is in the 70s, and I will agree with you with this, but in terms of corporate America, in the 70s and 80s and even the 90s, whatever happened in the streets, what wasn't felt. You know, there was almost like you closed that door, went up that elevator, and you didn't have to deal with that. And what I think changed and what this generation did was bring the movement to the reception area, brought the movement into the boardroom, brought the movement into the office of the CEO, where you could not look away. I remember very specifically, you know, you fight for certain things. Can we say this? Can we send this letter? And now it's a non-starter. Yes, we're going to do that. Yes, we're going to do that. That, I think, for me is, when you say they feel it, is the consequences happen immediately. It wasn't like it happened 10 years later. It's like something happened on the street, something was felt in the corporate boardroom, and then actions were taken immediately. And that's what I think is very unique and different about this generation, is that there wasn't this lag between what was happening and then what can occur in the daily lives of people who go to work, because you spend a majority of your time at work, and where you segregate is on the weekends. You go to a certain church, you spend a certain time with certain people. So the greatest possible chance that we have to get something right is to be in those corporate boardrooms and be in those companies and make the changes that we need to do, because it's going to spill back out into the streets as a more inclusive, more equitable world. Now, I may be a little Pollyanna in that, but I truly believe that. And that to me is what I'm thankful for this generation in doing, is closing that lag time between movement and then action within corporate America.
So I would add a couple of things. One, I think, the sort of place where Tiffany started from is really right, because the truth is it has been a build, right? It's just, we know that often it's not sustainable. It was only 4 years ago that we had Michael Brown and Freddie Gray and all the things that went on, and literally nobody said anything and it stopped being covered. And then when it happened in 2020, 4 years later, it was a revolutionary response. Some of that was that you had a captive audience. I used to tell, one of my friends used to get really upset with me, but it's just a fact. If I had on a hat or glasses, so many of my white colleagues wouldn't recognize me, quote unquote. Oh, I didn't recognize you in your hat or your glasses. And I said, they're not taking me in, right? They think I'm a messenger or something. They're just not taking me in. And so it is easy for a lot of people not to take things in. And last year, we got taken in. People really saw it. Technology plays a huge part in it. The fact that phones are now recording, and can record for long periods of time. Even the phones we have 4 or 5 years ago might not have been able to record for 9 minutes, right? Or it wouldn't have been a good enough picture. We certainly, the information is already super, super filtered, right? But it was even more filtered because there were actually fewer social media platforms. There were few people on those social media platforms. And then when you couple that with the fact that people are actually taking real risks, and remember, corporate America is just part of it, because there's plenty of people that don't work in large corporations. In fact, I think it's 2/3 of the country works in small and medium-sized companies. But if people are going to the office and saying, this is important, we can't ignore it. And when some of those people are at places like Google and Amazon, and they're walking out and they're saying, this is an equality issue, which ultimately becomes a human rights issue when it comes to things like, minimum wage. Well, guess who's going to disproportionately benefit from that? If 60% of US employees are hourly wage employees. So COVID had a disproportionate effect on people like that. When you actually have folks who are willing to say, hey, I'm standing up for this, this is important, even if I'm not an hourly wage employee, because I know that my colleagues are affected by it. Companies have had to really step up. And so one of the things that helped is it's not just about shareholders, it's about stakeholders. And stakeholders, especially when it comes to corporate America, and media falls in that, a lot of the strongest stakeholders are actually the employees in that employee base, and people actually speaking up, like Tiffany said, taking it to the reception area, taking it beyond that, taking it to the boardroom, people being willing to walk out, people being willing to stage sit-ins, et cetera, makes a huge difference. And so I think it's a combination of all those things happening. It's the technology, it's the speed at which this stuff can spread through social media. Remember, a lot of us found out about things like bin Laden before we saw it in the news, because we saw it on Twitter first, right? You may have gone and done some fact checking to see if it was actually true. So much of what we see now, even things that Detavio is covering, Revolt Black News, he probably hears about first via some sort of social media or other mechanism, and that has allowed us to not just respond more quickly, but also to spread the word so much more widely, and that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, but I think one of the issues still and remains in terms of the numbers Detavio's talking about is still, who are the gatekeepers to the national stories? We know that again, Black folks' struggle for liberation in this country has always been centrally intertwined with storytelling, with narrative, whether in the church, whether in literature, whether in music. Telling one story has always been central. For years, centuries, the issue of racism in the country was often referred to by white people as the Negro problem or the colored problem. And, James Baldwin 60 years ago says there's not a Negro problem in America, there's a white problem. It's just an inversion and, a sentence, and it changes the entire, conversation, but, you also think about, Audre Lorde, one of his peers, who said, you cannot use the master's tool to dismantle the master's house. And to use the word their master intentionally. We certainly know the history of the word, but we know what she's doing there. And, I'm a civil rights lawyer, and I've worked on these issues and the intersection of kind of policing and race and education. And there's a producer who's, brought me on MSNBC shows, many times to talk about these assorted killings of Black people by the police. And he once apologetically said to me, I only, bring you on when a Black person's killed by the police. And I wish we'd bring you on from some other stories. And, yeah, I'd love to talk about Black joy. I'd love to talk about Black happiness. I'd love to talk about Black humor, I think I'm pretty funny, I'd love to talk about range of Black experience in this country, and not only talk about the violence perpetrated on Black bodies. And so if the gatekeepers continue to only focus on those stories and not focus enough on those stories as well, so only the violence of George Floyd, perpetrated against George Floyd, to Rahsan's point, but what about the day-to-day violence perpetrated against Black and brown people disproportionately in our prisons? What about the intersection of class and race in this country? Like, are we gonna have those conversations? And so last year, after this explosion of conversation, you saw so many brands, so many national corporations, all of a sudden announcing funds and using language to what you said earlier, Tiffany, right? Language they never used before. All of a sudden, they want to talk about Black justice. They want to talk about systemic racism. I saw companies releasing statements every single day. And on one hand, again, the awareness is a good thing. And on one hand, the dollars either coming to institutions that are doing the work, or the increased investment internally in companies of incorporating kind of Black stories and Black voices. Clearly, those are good things, but they're being done for the benefit of the companies often. How are we really ensuring that this money is being used in the right way? We live in a capitalist society, as we all know. Central to the capitalist success in this country is the exploitation of workers, overwhelmingly Black, brown, low-income white workers, Asian, et cetera. So we can't separate those two realities. And so when multinational and massive companies are now investing what for them are small amounts of money and using the language of the day to show their wokeness, there's also some attempt to co-opt the message. And so how do you balance the infusion of dollars, the infusion of, well, we should tell more stories, and we've seen that last year to this year, with the inherently dangerous reality that oftentimes it's the very wolves themselves who are bringing this additional investment in money. And so how do you do that? How do you ensure that it's being used in the right way? How do you ensure it's being directed in the right way?
I mean, that's a powerful, powerful question. What I will say is I was on a panel regarding CSR and social justice, and in the president of En-ROADS, they did research and showed that hundreds of billions, well, I would say, okay, not hundreds of billions, probably like, okay, I'm gonna break it down a little bit, 10 billion or so, was invested maybe 7 years ago. There was just this rush to invest. And they looked at what was done since that investment, and not much had changed. And so we're now on another milestone. We're on another hallmark. There's been this, and the investment actually tripled because of what happened last year, tripled. And so now we have another milestone, and now we'll have, 4 or 5 years, because obviously, the time gets truncated to see what actually happened because of that investment. Because for me as a DE&I officer, I'm not really rushing to get headlines. I put my head down and do the work. It's really important that that gets communicated, because you have companies that will focus on, we got to get these headlines out. We got to show that we're doing something. And at the end of the day, they feel good about that. But to your point, Khary, like the funds and stuff that are created, if they're not managed, if there's not an infrastructure built to manage and create criteria to discover what the needs of the organizations that you're supporting actually need, a lot of these funds are just, let's just give it out. Let's just get rid of it as soon as we can. And what I'm asking and what I'm seeing, at least I can speak for my own company, we have a structure. We support organizations that are really, doing the work. But you're right, there was a swath, from places that we didn't even, think money could come from. And then the other piece that happened is that, I saw this because I'm on LinkedIn, and write on LinkedIn regularly. I remember in 2019, there was probably an opening for chief diversity officer once a month. And it was like for small companies or for colleges. So LinkedIn did a report. The growth of that position in 1 year was over 730%. And now there's 19 a day. Not 19 a week, not 19 a month, 19 a day positions that are open. So you have people on the inside now that are going to be working to figure out what to do with the funds and the money. But the dangerous part that you say is, and I think it's the media's responsibility, but are they willing to take that responsibility to point out that inequity of some of these companies? And I won't name names, but some of these companies are delving into, social justice, and yet, have, committed horrible atrocities against Black and brown people. And so I think that's the part that's the 2.0 of this, when the dust clears, is really taking a look at following the money, where it goes and how it was used. Right now, we're in the receiving mode. But I think at some point we have to look at, did this really make a difference? And then part of what happened last year when, there was those inflection points, as you say, that really led to an increased amount of social justice. People were asking me, like, I got letters, I got notes. Oh my God, Tiff, I'm so happy. I'm so proud of what you do. I mean, just notes from everywhere. I've been doing this work for 24 years. People ask me, like, what can I do? And I simply said to everybody, I was like, just keep the same energy, because I knew that a year from now, that energy would dissipate and people would go back to living their lives. And that's exactly, unfortunately, is exactly what's happening now. People are not keeping the same energy. They just want to go back to their day jobs. They don't want to do this. They want to just focus. And I'm speaking specifically, and I'm just being really honest, about allies. They look at this social justice initiative almost as a tourist. So they dip their toe in it. They take a few pictures, they take it in, and then they move on. And this is people's lives. And so that's the thing that, truthfully, I'm frustrated about now, is that there's a lessening of that energy that made them step out of their, of their doors and their front doors to march.
Yeah, I hear you. And I think that it makes sense what you're saying. And I think there has to be accountability that goes beyond them reporting on themselves, because that's really the thing, is like, a lot of companies have CSR report cards, but they report on themselves. So what's really keeping them accountable?
Right.
Khary, I think you understand this when it comes to, who's going to control the narrative. Despite the fact that Detavio has used the Black free press, it ain't free, right? It needs to be free in the sense it needs to have the freedom to report what is truly happening, but it does cost money. It costs money to have reporters. It costs money to do fact checking. It costs money to do research. It costs money to travel, to interviews, all that stuff. And so the funding is super important. Sometimes especially when things are at such a deficit that you're not going to get to anything remotely resembling equality without like real intervention. That's where the government is supposed to step in. That's where you fund commissions that are going to now fund operations that, and it actually would be relatively easy in some ways. It's systematic. You're setting up a mechanism in 200 cities and towns that specifically focuses on Black news and information, and it's funded for X number of years via some corporate tax or whatever, and that helps to create it. Ultimately, policies have to be important. When companies, especially ones that use airwaves, they're supposed to be held accountable. The U.S. government, when it spends money, the U.S. Army, Health and Human Services, et cetera, they're supposed to spend a certain percentage of the money that they're spending with, Latinx owned, Black owned, Asian owned, et cetera, LGBTQ owned companies. Are they held accountable to it? Not a lot of the time, but that is technically how it's supposed to be used. And so if we want to make sure that the national news stories, and frankly, we talk about national news a lot, but the local news stories are actually in many ways more important, because that's the stuff that affects people day to day. We've been talking a lot about voting rights. That's a state by state thing. That is as important as anything you're going to generally have to deal with on a national level. And so it's super important that the information, be able to be gathered, that the facts be checked, and that it be disseminated to the people who really need to understand what it is, what referendum it is they're voting for in June or November or whatever it is. And that on some level generally needs intervention. The only times I've seen it work otherwise where it's people have been able to really move the needle are, and they even choose what they're going to fund, right? As like a Gates Foundation, something that massive that they can actually move the needle in a given area. But we know we haven't necessarily gotten funding from them around education. It's just something that they actually say they care about. And so I do think that is probably necessary on some level. It has to be, important to the administration. It has to be funded, and it has to be. There needs to be actual oversight to make sure that what we're asking for is happening. Because the truth is that right now there's very little in terms of what, especially relative to what used to be true, news and reporting that is. Truly professional journalism. There's lots of blogging and tons of opinions and punditing and stuff like that are shared. But that's a different thing when you're talking about folks that are disseminating important information that needs, that hopefully helps to create the systems of equality that we're looking for, helps to inform the public and the electorate of the things that are going to affect their lives ongoingly, in particular around things like voting rights and stuff like that are clearly set up to disenfranchise folks of color. There's no doubt that that's a lot of what's being voted on right now is specifically around that. So I think you would need some sort of intervention from government or a really, really strong coalition of very powerful corporations in order to move the needle in any appreciable way.
Yeah, and just my few little things to add on. I think, Khary, you're 100% right in that with the death of George Floyd, supporting Black people and supporting Black culture all of a sudden becomes green. I think that the last report I just saw said something like 60% of people say that silence has consequences, and for brands to be silent on issues of social justice is unacceptable, right? And so it's, yes, brands are showing up because there's humanity there, but they're also showing up because they now understand that it can hit their pocket. And I think the key piece to us being able to keep our foot on the pedal is, one, the accountability that Rahsan talks about. I think we lean much closer to like that coalition that he's talking about versus depending on government, even though it'd be nice if they jumped in. But the other thing is just for people of color to learn how to weaponize their dollars, right? We have to get really good at punishing those brands and those advertisers who are not taking care of our people. We have to get really good at those brands who are not reinvesting, those brands who, all the ways that Rahsan and Tiffany have called them out for being racist, for saying, I won't give you one of my pennies. I'm going to take all of that money and invest it in the brands that reinvest in my community. I think that's like a key piece that we're missing, that we talk a lot about in terms of how to kind of keep the pressure on. And then the last thing that I was going to say from the Revolt perspective, so this is something I actually learned from Rahsan. So Rahsan used to talk to me about his Viacom days, and maybe you want to tell the story instead of me, but this idea of how consumers saw you all as a filter for advertisers. Can you tell that story really quickly? It might have been Nickelodeon or something like that. I'm gonna let you tell it, so I'll make sure I get it right from here on out.
It was specifically MTV, and they thought of, they looked at us. Well, consumers looked at MTV as a place that was like an arbiter of cool, and so they needed to come there to know what was what and what they should be wearing, etc. And marketers really thought of it as a prism through which their message is being filtered so that it lands in the way they want it to land.
And so what I would say is at Revolt, we're taking on that same strategy, right? We do see ourselves as the arbiters of cool, but also like the arbiters of who really gives a damn about our community. And so we're very quick to walk into rooms and say, we don't need your pennies or your dollars. If this is transactional, we don't need your pennies or your dollars. If this is performative, we're growing. We're going to be fine. The brands that show up on Revolt, we want our audience to know those are people who truly care about investing in your community, at least in terms of our conversations. And so that's the other way that we're trying to play it, which is to be a filter. We're not going to let people jump on a channel if they're just trying to get points and check a box. That's not what we're here to do. We're trying to make impact.
Well, first, we're definitely going to call Detavio the arbiter of cool from now on. That's just new.
Not Detavio, Revolt.
Detavio, that's a fact.
But I obviously talked to the three of you all evening. We've been talking, for close to an hour and a half, and we're going to end in the next, 5 or 6 minutes. But I wanted to ask you a really specific question. It's a big question, but it's specific, and to really ask you to kind of lean into your careers in this sector to try to answer it. And Rahsan already touched on this. For people who are aligned politically like we are, so many of the big tent issues, the intersectional issues, again, whether you're talking about immigration or LGBTQ rights, whether you're talking about reproductive rights for women, the environment, civil rights, criminal justice, they all intersect with voting. If really everybody in this country could vote, who should be able to vote, a proper age, so many of the issues we care about would be in a stronger place. It's quite likely that this year, Roe v. Wade will be struck down, not because the ethos of the country changed, not because there was a movement, but because of undemocratically appointed justices to the Supreme Court. And so when we think about the restrictions on voting, when you think about the fact that nearly 400 state legislature acts have been passed to restrict the right to voting. One during the Trump administration in North Carolina, the Supreme Court of North Carolina deemed it surgical in its approach to remove the rights to vote of African Americans, of Black folk. And I was on a Zoom earlier this week held by a national civil rights organization where they asked about 15 or 16 artists to come together with them. And the reason was that they felt we needed better messaging about this issue of the franchise, about voting. So again, we saw millions in the streets last year, appropriately, over the murder of a man. But where are the millions in the streets now about the restriction of voting that will affect all the issues that we hold so dear? And the reason this civil rights leader called this group of us together who work in the arts, who are writers and visual artists, et cetera, was he knows the importance of messaging in this moment, of how to galvanize people. And so I wonder, in the space of media, in the space of advertising, in the space of the news, all the places that you work, how do we do a better job, if we're talking about social justice tonight and media, how do we do a better job of framing what one could argue is the preeminent social justice issue right now, because it affects every issue that we care about? And I'm wondering if you could just each speak briefly to that.
Yeah, my first thought is like, it's language. Like, I think, man, Trump was masterful at this for the last 4 years. Just again, like boiling things down to kung flu, as disrespectful as it is, as an idea, it travels incredibly fast. Voter suppression as an idea is not going to travel super fast. I think ultimately at the end of the day, and I don't even know, maybe there's one idea or one way to get there, but I always think that the answer to these things is bringing it down to the block. Like, you got to speak in their language. You got to make them understand how this is specifically going to impact them, their mama, their daddy, their sister, their daughter. And that's got to be the starting place for whatever messaging comes up. I'm not going to be able to get there, in 2 minutes in this conversation. I'm going to leave my contribution just to be saying, like, we've got to make it real and tangible for them at their level, whatever level that is. You got to meet people where they are. And then I'm going to take it as a thing to think about after this meeting, because it's an issue. Last thing I'll say is our Juneteenth programming is largely dedicated to this issue, because we too are very nervous about what's happening in the country.
Yeah, I mean, you think about the fact that many of us, and I've had to relearn a lot of stuff, coming up, just looking at our education from the time we entered, let's say, first grade to the time we left and then chose our college home. We weren't really taught the importance of voting. It was maybe 1 or 2 paragraphs in history class. Maybe people had a whole semester. If they were really lucky, there was a part 1 and part 2 over their sophomore and junior year. And, obviously going back that far will take a lot of time, but there's also a movement in education. My sister's a teacher, and what she fights against is just to teach the basic things that will embolden her students, who are primarily of color, to be good citizens. We weren't really taught that. We were given the opportunity to say the Pledge of Allegiance and things of that nature, but never was it connected to understanding the importance of voting. I grew up in Boston, so the vote was embedded in us pretty early, the importance of voting. It was like, among my friends, it was a social event. We made it like something important. And so, you know, that started very early on. So I think about, now, obviously there's many people that have been impaneled to look at voting. There's been voting drives, you know, Sony was part of a huge voting push that says, you know, the importance of get out the vote. You know, Puffy or Diddy or Love, I'm trying to figure out what his new name is, did Vote or Die, you know, which was very powerful. We've had these slogans that, and now I look back on that and I was like, that, even that phrase was revolutionary. Like I saw it and I was like, at the time with my awareness, I was like, that's a great campaign. But now someone who, where we all are on the precipice of possibly losing the vote, that's as simple as you can get, vote or die, you know? And when you bring it back to the block, as Detavio says, you know, it's interesting because you talk about how they're going to be impacted. Let's talk about how they're already impacted, and how even when you think about the vote and how people talk about, well, I'm not going to vote because it's not going to change anything. That is a culture that's embedded in our culture. You have to untangle that, just that simple conversation that's been handed down from generations where, you know, kids weren't taken to vote by their, like it gets so deep. And like Detavio said, it's hard to cover in 2 minutes, but, you know, just quickly, I think it starts within the schools and understanding in terms of history and civic lessons, what our kids are being taught. It starts with, you know, making it as exciting to vote as it is to go, you know, and post something on TikTok. You know, I think this new media like TikTok has been very revolutionary in pushing narratives around health, around vaccines, around different things. Well, let's use that new medium to push things around voting and, you know, Roe v. Wade. So I think using the newer mediums that are really embedded in the culture right now would be helpful as well.
So can I curse?
Sure.
We got to stop.
I know what you're going to say.
We just have to stop bullshitting, because the truth is we could ensure that votes would be secure and that they're individual and they're not double counted, and you'd never have to leave your home. We know this. I bet you everybody on this panel banks that way. And you wouldn't do it if you didn't know that the systems were fairly trustworthy. They're not infallible, the system is, but they're trustworthy enough. We know that it's possible. So one, we have to remove barriers of entry in that way, like the actual voting. We know we need to remove the barriers of entry of, like, if, you know, for people who have been convicted, you know, of you know, obviously felonies. We know that there has to be barriers of entry removed around, you know, things like your status, et cetera. You know, I think lots of people talk about the idea that civics is important and that we need to bring that back to schools. But ultimately, if we want to give people a sense of the value of something, we really need to really put it in ways that I think that they understand. And the truth is, if voting wasn't such a big deal, it wouldn't be fighting so hard to take it away from us. If it wasn't hugely important, they wouldn't be fighting so hard to keep us from doing it. That is the key. And look, at the mayoral elections in New York and LA, 25% of the electorate is showing up. So clearly there's a disconnect between what's important, what, you know, how it affects your life, and then people's actions. And so I think people should get the day off to vote. It only needs to be twice a year, right? The primaries and the generals. That's not that hard. If we had to take one holiday away to do it, we probably could. Two, we need to make the barriers, you know, in terms of like being able to do it hopefully without leaving your home, but in some other simpler ways. You can buy a lottery ticket at a grocery store. Why can't you vote? And then thinking about at the end of the day, how to ensure that the greatest number of people are able to take part in this thing that we know is one of the biggest rights that we have as citizens. And that means we have to stop BSing about really wanting it to be at the top of our list in terms of priorities, and actually do things that are going to remove those barriers. So I think that's what we have to do.
Thank you, Rahsan. We're going to give our board co-chair the last word of the evening. I want to thank Rahsan and Detavio and Tiffany for just talking with me this evening, for the powerful and beautiful conversation. They are emblematic of the board of directors of the Brotherhood Sister Soul. Each of these three people who joined us this evening are just fierce brilliant people. You've heard that tonight, folks who are really leaders in their field. We have these conversations at the Brotherhood Sister Soul on a regular basis, these public conversations, because we think it's important to build community, to share information, to engage in the necessary and difficult conversations, to struggle with the big issues of our time. We see it as part of our contribution as an organization. We don't always do them with board members. This evening, we thought this was the proper group to talk with. There was no reason to go outside the family, and they certainly didn't disappoint in any way. I encourage you to learn more about the Brotherhood Sister Soul, to follow us on social media, to go to our website at brotherhood-sistersoul.org and learn more about our work, to join us in the movement that we're a part of as we educate our young people, as we train the field on our model, and as we organize every single day for social justice and for change. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for being with us this evening. We wish everyone the best, and let's keep up the good fight.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.